Hey guys, today we start our long meandering journey through one of the least glamorous, most frostbitten chapters of North American life, the winters faced by frontier families. Imagine you standing in a clearing that doesn't look like much more than a patch of snow-buried trees. The sky is pale grey, the kind of colour that makes you wonder if the sun has retired early. Wind sneaks in through every gap, biting at your cheeks, and you're only a few logs away from building what you hope will pass for a cabin. You probably won't survive this. But luckily this isn't you, it's just history, and you get to enjoy it from the warm comfort of your bed. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now picture yourself trudging through knee-deep drifts before breakfast. Your boots crunch in a rhythm that feels both steady and exhausting. There's no paved road, no cheerful neighbour with a snowblower, just you, the forest, and the constant reminder that if you don't get this cabin finished, the blizzard wins. Scholars point out that many frontier diaries describe mornings like this as clear and bracing. You and I might describe them more honestly as frozen and inconvenient. Historians still argue whether people genuinely felt invigorated by this kind of cold, or whether that was just the polite way to complain in a diary you hoped your grandchildren might read. Inside your half-built shelter, the wind whistles through gaps in the logs like a poorly tuned flute. You press your ear against the wall, wondering whether that's the wind or your stomach growling. The cabin's interior smells of sap and damp earth, and every breath comes out as a ghostly puff rising into the rafters that don't quite meet. You shift to the fire pit you've scratched into the frozen ground. A few coals smoulder there, the only source of warmth, though they smoke more than they flame. The sensation of smoke clinging to your hair is not unlike walking through the world's least glamorous perfume shop, yet you'd rather have a smoky nose than frostbite. Think of it like working the graveyard shift literally, since the frozen earth outside could easily double as a cemetery if things go poorly. The sensory world of these mornings was sharp, the crunch of snow, the snap of firewood, the metallic tang of cold air that makes your teeth ache. Every detail presses in on you. A crow caws somewhere above, but the sound is muffled, as if even birds know shouting is a waste of energy in this weather. The world is blanketed both quiet and merciless. And yet there's a strange calm in all of this. Your routine gathering wood, scraping frost from the inside of the window, piling on whatever furs you can find, gives structure to days that would otherwise blur into an endless blizzard. Scholars still debate whether frontier families truly accepted this monotony with stoic grace, or whether they simply had no other choice. Either way, it's a lifestyle so slow and repetitive that it might actually be the perfect bedtime story. But of course, survival isn't just about calm routines. The real challenge begins when you realize the blizzard outside is not going anywhere anytime soon. The wind rattles the walls, the cold presses harder, and you begin to suspect you'll be shoveling snow both inside and out. And as you settle down, staring at the flickering fire, you realize this was only the first step. The real work, hauling timber through endless snow, still waits. But that strange task is exactly what we'll trudge into next. You wake again, but of course you never truly slept. The wind pushed against the thin walls all night like an impatient guest who forgot their manners. Your straw pillow crunches when you turn your head, reminding you that comfort is a privilege, not a guarantee. Outside the world is an enormous sheet of white. Snow has piled itself against the door in friendly but immovable heaps, as if saying, "Don't bother leaving, I'll come in if I want." Today's duty is gathering timber. You step outside, boots squeaking against hard frost, breath puffing like steam from a tired train engine. Each step makes a hollow crunch, as if you're chewing through winter itself. The forest waits just beyond the clearing, dark pines hunched like monks guarding a secret. With an axe slung across your shoulder, you look less like a heroic woodsman, and more like someone on their way to an especially unpleasant workout session, except this gym charges in frostbite. Historians note that frontier families rarely worked alone. Spouses, children, even reluctant neighbours helped fell trees together. Some journals claim 4 hands make quicker work, though one gets the impression those hands also did a fair amount of complaining. Scholars still debate how much time families actually spent logging in winter versus stockpiling during the fall. Some argue the stories of frantic winter lumbering are exaggerated because who in their right mind wants to swing an axe when the handle itself is trying to freeze to your gloves? But then again, necessity doesn't wait for ideal conditions. You pick your first tree. The bark is rough, icy, and the trunk looms tall, daring you to try. The sound of your axe against it is sharp, echoing through the still air. Chop, crack, silence then again. A rhythm builds, part mechanical, part meditative. You feel the sting in your arms, the cold in your fingertips, and the slow satisfaction of progress. In the quiet forest, each strike feels oddly ceremonial, like you're announcing to winter itself that you still exist. And yet progress is deceptive. Timber has a way of humbling the eager. Trees don't fall in minutes, they fall after hours of stubborn repetition, after sweat steams against the freezing air. Your back aches, your nose drips, and snowflakes insist on landing in your eyelashes. The world becomes smaller, just you, the axe, and the occasional sarcastic thought like who signed me up for this frontier gym membership. Eventually the tree groans, a low creak, the kind that makes your pulse quicken. You step back, boots slipping on icy ground as the trunk tips forward in slow motion. Down it goes, branches snapping against neighbours with a noise that's both violent and soothing. Violent because nature resists soothing, because now you finally have fuel and walls in the making. Dragging the log back toward your cabin is a new trial. You tie rope around it, tug, stumble, tug again. Every few yards you pause, bent double, watching your breath fog into the cold air. Snow squeaks under the weight, resisting you like a stubborn mule. Sensory anchors pile in the whistle of wind slipping between trees, the scratch of rope against raw palms, the hollow thud when you finally drop the log beside your half-built walls. These details would drive most modern people mad. For frontier families, they were the daily soundtrack, endless, repetitive, and strangely comforting once you accepted there was no alternative. And still historians argue about the pace of this work. Was it daily drudgery that consumed every waking hour or more of an occasional necessity, broken up by hunting, sewing, and the endless struggle to keep children from freezing their mittens solid? The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in the middle, buried under the snowdrifts of memory. As you lean your axe against the wall, sweat cooling too quickly on your back, you hear it again, the wind. Louder now, slipping through gaps like a mischievous intruder. You know tomorrow will require more wood, more dragging, more aching arms. But for tonight, the cabin feels a little sturdier, a little more real. And just when you think you've earned rest, you remember logs alone won't keep the cold out. You'll need something else to seal those gaps. But what you find to fill them may surprise you. The walls stand, but they breathe like a wheezy old accordion. Between each log cracks gape open, cheerful little highways, where the wind rushes in as though it paid for season tickets. You press your hand against one gap, feel the icy stream slide across your skin, and realize that unless you solve this problem, your new home will function more like a winter flute than a fortress. The solution, according to generations of frontier families, is packing the spaces with mud, clay, moss, or whatever sticky, stubborn substance you can find before your fingers give up. Imagine kneeling with a bucket of frozen mud, your hands going numb while you smear it along wooden seams. It's essentially frosting a giant, very unappetizing cake, except this cake occasionally leaks snow. Historians still argue whether mud was the standard filler, or if moss and straw played larger roles. Some accounts swear by swamp moss, praising its natural insulation, while others dismiss it as a soggy disaster once thawing began. Diaries sometimes mention children being assigned to collect moss from tree trunks, a task that sounds charming until you remember those children were also shivering in threadbare mittens. You scoop mud with a stick, jam it into a gap, and step back to admire the lumpy, uneven line. It's not pretty, but neither are frostbitten toes. Each handful you smear whispers a small victory against the cold. Wind hisses through the remaining gaps as if mocking your efforts, but every patch you make steals back just a bit of warmth. The smell of damp earth fills the air, strangely comforting in a landscape dominated by snow and smoke. It clings to your gloves, your sleeves, even your hair. You look like a clumsy sculptor working on a masterpiece that no one will admire except your grateful lungs. A joke surfaces, at least no one can complain the cabin lacks earthy character. Sensory anchors surround you, the crunch of half-frozen clumps, the gritty smear under your fingernails, the faint trickle of snowmelt dripping off the roof. The sounds blend into the background, steady as a lullaby, reminding you that sometimes the most boring chores are the most essential. Some scholars point out that mud chinking was a temporary measure. As spring came, thawing often left families with sagging walls and gooey messes that had to be scraped and redone. Others argue that more careful mixtures, mud blended with straw or hair, lasted much longer. Archaeological evidence from old cabins shows both approaches existed, so the debate remains unsolved. But either way, the nightly relief of blocking even a fraction of the cold was worth the mess. You pause, leaning back on your heels. The wall looks sturdier now, less like a drafty skeleton and more like a fortress in progress. For a moment you can almost believe the storm will stay outside where it belongs. The wind rattles again, but softer, muted, as though grudgingly acknowledging your effort. And yet as you stand there smudged in mud, you hear another sound, the crunch of snow outside, slow and deliberate. Could be a neighbour, could be a deer, could be something less comforting. You hold your breath, ear pressed against the half-chinked wall. The snow shifts again. Whoever or whatever it is, it's not in a hurry. But the next step will carry you further into the storm than you planned. You tighten your scarf, push the cabin door open with a grunt, and step into the snow again. It greets you like a stubborn acquaintance who never takes the hint, pressing against your legs, clinging to your boots, and reminding you that today is no easier than yesterday. Your mission is clear snowshoes. Without them, you'll sink waist deep before you've gone 10 steps into the woods. And sinking into snow is only fun if you're 6 years old, and don't mind losing your mittens permanently. Frontier families relied on snowshoes not just for hunting, but for the most basic errands, fetching firewood, checking traps, even visiting neighbours half a mile away. You trudge to the small shed, or what generously passes as one, and pull out a pair of rough frames. They look like giant tennis rackets, which is why modern kids sometimes laugh at them. You, however, know these awkward contraptions are the difference between progress and frostbite. The design wasn't invented by settlers at all. It came from indigenous peoples across the northern regions. Scholars agree snowshoes spread west with Europeans because they simply worked. But historians still debate the exact origins of certain shapes: oval, elongated, or the kind with a pointed tail that drags behind you like a stubborn leash. Some accounts praise the long shoes for speed, while others swear the shorter ones made turning corners easier. Either way, no one in their right mind would argue against using them once the snow rose past your knees. You strap them on clumsily, leather thongs stiff with frost. The first few steps are comedy itself, wide-legged awkward, like someone trying to dance after spinning in circles too long. Your boots threaten to slip free, your balance teeters, and you mutter something sarcastic about how this should have been advertised as fun winter exercise. Yet within minutes the rhythm takes hold. Your feet press down broad patches of snow, and instead of sinking, you skim across the surface. Each step crunches differently now, softer, more forgiving, like walking across a pillow that's had too much time in the freezer. The forest greets you with silence, save for the faint whistle of wind weaving between the pines. Every so often you hear a creak overhead as snow shifts on heavy branches. It's a quiet world, muted by the blanket underfoot, and each sound is magnified. Your breath-puffing clouds, the squeak of bindings, the far-off snap of something animal or tree you can't tell. You stop to adjust a strapped glance around and realize just how alone you are out here. No footprints except your own. No colour except endless white and dark trunks. Some settlers described this solitude as peaceful, while others confessed in diaries that it gnawed at them like hunger. Scholars argue whether frontier folk were more resilient to loneliness than we are today, but considering the number of ghost stories passed around winter fires, perhaps they weren't as stoic as the myths suggest. You bend to pick up a bundle of fallen branches. Each crack of wood against your gloved hand is sharp, ringing in the quiet. You tie them together, sling them over your shoulder, and feel the tug against your tired muscles. The snowshoes help, but the effort is still punishing. Every few yards you pause, heart-thudding, frost forming on your eyelashes. A little voice whispers, "Is the cabin even worth it?" But then another gust of wind hits your face, and you know the answer. Without the cabin, you'd be nothing more than another forgotten figure in the snow. You plod back toward the clearing, your footprints a winding trail across the whiteness. The cabin looms into view, squat and stubborn, waiting for you to return. You think about how many times you'll repeat this trip, a dozen, 100, maybe more. Snowshoes will be your constant companions, creaking underfoot, reminding you that survival is never graceful, it's just persistent. As you lean the wood against the half-chinked wall, the faint jingle of something metallic carries through the air. Bells maybe, though no one nearby keeps livestock large enough to wear them. You freeze listening. The sound drifts closer, then fades, swallowed by the storm. And suddenly you realize the forest has more voices than you expected. But the roof over your head still waits to be built. The walls stand taller now, patched with mud and sealed with stubborn determination. But above your head there's only sky grey, heavy and eager to dump more snow straight into your living quarters. Without a roof, your so-called cabin is nothing more than a glorified fence. So today you balance logs and bark to create a shield against the storm. Roof building is not glamorous work. It's more like arguing with gravity using nothing but sticks, straw and hope. You haul the first long beams onto the frame. The wood is slick with frost and you mutter a few choice words, not curses exactly, but phrases like blasted log and frozen nuisance. They sound historical enough to keep things PG. With each heave, your muscles burn and the rope bites into your gloves. If there were a frontier gym, this would be the most unpopular class: roof lifting 101, burn calories or freeze. Historians disagree on what kind of roof most families built. Some argue bark slabs layered with straw were common. Others insist that shakes thin, split wooden shingles dominated. Archaeological digs show both styles, suggesting people used whatever was most available. Bark was quick but leaky straw insulated, but invited mice, and shakes required tools many settlers lacked. Diaries often describe roofs dripping merrily during thaws, which is a polite way of saying it leaked constantly and we got used to it. You hoist bark panels, laying them carefully across beams. The texture is rough, curling at the edges, smelling faintly of resin. Beneath your boots, the beams creak and sway, sending up small puffs of powder where snow has collected. Your fingers sting as you press down each slab, pinning it with wooden pegs hammered in clumsy strokes. The sound echoes sharp in the cold air, tap, thud, tap, like a heartbeat against the storm. The sensory world is relentless. The groan of timber shifting under weight, the flutter of straw catching on the wind, the sting of ice chips blown into your face. You cough when a handful of dust drifts down, lodging in your throat. It tastes like you've licked the world's oldest attic. Still you keep at it. Because if you stop, snow will keep falling inside your home like a rude guest tracking mud across a clean floor. Scholars debate how quickly roofs were completed. Some say within days, others claim it stretched into weeks of precarious balancing acts. Considering your current wobble as you lean too far over the edge, you're inclined to believe the latter. Frontier life was rarely about efficiency. It was about persistence, repeating the same clumsy act until the house didn't collapse. At last you step back inside. The roof above is uneven, a patchwork quilt of bark, straw and prayers. But it holds. The wind rattles. The snow slides off in small flurries, and for the first time your cabin feels like an actual shelter. Shadows gather beneath the beams, darker than before, as if the building itself is finally deciding to cooperate. And then comes the realization walls and roof alone won't keep you alive. Without a fire, without that glowing center, you've built nothing more than a very elaborate freezer. But starting a hearth in this drafty hut will prove far trickier than you expect. The cabin has walls, it has a roof, but it feels like a box made of ice. Every breath you take lingers in the air, visible, twisting upward until it vanishes into the rafters. Your nose stings, your toes ache, and you know exactly what this place needs: fire. Not a polite candle flame, not a few smouldering embers. A hearth, a glowing center. Something to remind the blizzard outside that you intend to stay warm whether it likes it or not. You crouch in the corner where the dirt has been scratched bare. That's where the hearth will go. You line it with rocks you collected days ago. Rocks that were annoyingly heavy when you hauled them back, each one slipping through numb fingers like it wanted to escape. Now though the stones form a shallow ring, sturdy enough to contain flame, you set a few kindling sticks inside, arrange them with the delicacy of a chef plating a meal no one's going to compliment, and strike flint against steel. The spark leaps, fizzles, then leaps again. Smoke curls upward before the fire itself even catches. You cough, waving your hand through the haze, muttering that no one in history has ever looked graceful starting a fire. Finally, the flame licks at the kindling, hesitant at first, then with more confidence. You lean closer, feeling the first brush of heat, tiny though it is. In a room that's been nothing but icy drafts, even this small glow feels like a miracle. Historians debate how permanent these hearths were. Some settlers dug shallow pits, others built clay-lined chimneys still. Others settled for a ring of stones and constant smoke inhalation. Diaries often mention smoke-filling cabins so thick that eyes watered all winter. Archaeologists have uncovered charred beams from early cabins, proof that one unlucky spark could turn cozy shelter into a pile of ashes faster than you could sneeze. Safety standards were, let's just say, casual at best. You sit back on your heels, watching smoke coil upward, not through a chimney, but into your face. Your hair smells instantly like you've been camping for 3 days straight, even though it's been 3 minutes. The fire pops, sending sparks skittering. One lands on your sleeve and you slap it out quickly, thinking this might be the frontier equivalent of workplace hazards. OSHA would have had a field day. The sensory details pile up: the crackle of wood, sharp and rhythmic, the smell of pine sap burning sweet but thick, the faint sting in your throat from too much smoke. Shadows dance against the log walls, making the cabin feel both alive and slightly mischievous, as though the place itself is pleased to finally be warming up. The wind howls outside, rattling the roof, but in here a small bubble of defiance glows orange in the gloom. Scholarly debates aside, every settler's memory of their first real fire must have been tinged with relief. Imagine stepping into a space that no longer feels like the outdoors wearing a flimsy disguise. Imagine thawing fingers, the ache of frozen feet slowly fading as warmth creeps back. And imagine realizing that despite the blizzard you've carved out a pocket of survival with nothing more than rock sticks and stubbornness. Still, the fire is just the beginning. A hearth without food is only half a comfort. The glow may keep you from freezing, but the gnawing in your stomach won't quiet down with warmth alone. You need something more substantial, meat, bread, anything that doesn't taste like desperation. And tomorrow you'll find yourself facing that challenge: how to prepare food when everything outside is frozen solid. The fire hisses quietly in the corner, casting your cabin in a wobbly amber light. For the first time, the space feels almost like a home rather than a glorified wooden box. The wind still pushes at the wall, snow still piles against the door, but the hearth buys you something precious: time. And just as you lean back to savour it, you hear the crunch of footsteps outside. The door creaks and in comes a neighbour, or rather a shape bundled in furs so thick you can barely make out a face. A muffled voice greets you, breath steaming in the chill, storm's getting worse. No kidding. Behind them trails their family faces, red from cold hands, clutching baskets of whatever supplies they were willing to risk carrying across half-buried paths. One of the children plops onto the floor near the fire without a word, as if it's the most natural thing in the world to intrude on your smoky new living room. On the frontier, neighbours weren't just helpful, they were lifelines. Many cabins stood miles apart, yet storms had a way of shrinking those distances. People trekked through waist-high drifts, snow-crusted to their eyebrows, to exchange news, borrow tools, or simply reassure each other they hadn't frozen to death. Historians note that such visits were both practical and social. A lone family could last a while, sure, but a community, even one scattered across valleys, was what turned survival into something almost resembling stability. You set out whatever you can offer: a turnip maybe, or the last of yesterday's cornmeal. Your neighbour contributes something equally humble. Soon there's a small pile of odd ingredients on the floorboards, a strange buffet that doesn't look like much until it's bubbling in a pot over the fire. The smell, earthy, bland, vaguely root-like, fills the room. You're under no illusions that this is fine dining, but when your nose is half frozen, any hot food feels Michelin star worthy. Scholars debate how often frontier families actually gathered like this in the dead of winter. Some argue frequent visits were essential for morale. Others point out that snowdrifts could trap families for weeks at a time. Diaries record both tales of joyful evenings spent swapping stories and equally gloomy entries about months without another human face. Perhaps it depended on luck geography, and whether your neighbour was the sort of person you'd actually want stuck in your cabin for hours. Still, the atmosphere warms. Someone pulls out a fiddle, its strings slightly warped from damp, and scratches out a tune. It's creaky, uneven, but it makes children laugh and adults sway in rhythm, shoulders finally unclenching. You add a joke. If we keep stomping the floor like this, maybe we'll pack the snow tighter under the cabin. Laughter ripples light and genuine, a rare sound in the long monotony of winter. The sensory world shifts with company. Instead of silence, you hear the clatter of wooden spoons, the soft hum of conversation, the squeak of wet mittens drying too close to the fire. The cabin smells of smoke and stew, and the flicker of lantern light mingles with firelight, turning faces into shifting silhouettes. The wind may roar outside, but here the storm seems distant, almost irrelevant. And yet just when you're lulled into the illusion of coziness, a draft pushes through the doorframe. The flames tremble, the shadows stretch, and you realize the blizzard isn't politely waiting for your gathering to end. It's pressing closer, louder, testing the limits of your new roof and half-sealed walls. The laughter quiets, replaced by a glance or two toward the rattling shutters. Because the truth is simple: no matter how many neighbours crowd inside, you can't keep the storm from entering if it truly wants to. And tonight it feels like the blizzard is only getting started. The laughter fades into the background as the storm presses harder. The blizzard is no longer content to be scenery, it's a participant. Snow pelts the roof with sharp little thuds, rattling like 1,000 impatient knuckles. The wind whips around the corners of the cabin, finding every weakness in your mud-sealed seams. A few flakes sneak in through the gaps, drifting lazily down as if they own the place. You glance upward, half expecting to see the roof peel away like the lid of a poorly fastened box. The neighbours shift uncomfortably. One man leans his shoulder against the door, which shivers on its wooden hinges. A child pulls the quilt tighter around her shoulders, eyes wide. The fire crackles bravely, but its warmth suddenly feels fragile like a candle in a drafty church. Historians describe these blizzards as both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in the sense that they came every year without fail. Extraordinary in the way each one tested families to their limits, reshaping their routines and forcing them to huddle closer. Scholars still argue whether diaries exaggerated the danger of these storms. Some insist that settlers hardened by repetition found them no more dramatic than a modern snow day. Others, however, point to reports of collapsed roofs, lost travellers and cattle buried alive under drifts. Perhaps the truth lies in between blizzards were survivable but never casual. The sounds inside are strangely loud, the creak of beams bending under weight, the sharp clatter of loose shingles tumbling into the snow, the muffled thump of a snowdrift sliding from the roof. Each noise is a reminder that the storm outside isn't an abstract idea. It's heavy, it's forceful, and it's trying to get in. You press your hand against the door. The wood is icy and the vibration of the wind runs straight into your bones. For a fleeting moment you imagine the entire cabin being lifted off like a child's toy. Then you laugh softly, nervous, tired, because if it did, you'd probably still be sweeping mud into the cracks on the way up. A neighbour suggests bracing the door with barrels so you shuffle across the floor dragging whatever you can find. The barrels thud into place, adding weight, though you're not entirely sure it will help. Still, the act of doing something, even if it's just rearranging your clutter, makes everyone breathe easier. Sensory anchors abound, the sting of cold air squeezing through every seam, the flickering firelight painting, shadows that lean and sway, the faint metallic taste in your mouth from too much smoke. The storm outside growls, but your tiny fortress insists on existing anyway. And here's the strange thing, in the middle of all this chaos a kind of calm settles. Frontier families often wrote that blizzards forced them into stillness. No chopping wood, no trudging through snow, no endless chores, just waiting. For once you sit still surrounded by neighbours who, despite their damp boots and weary faces, create a sense of shared survival. It's boring in the best possible way, the kind of boredom that comes with relief. Yet even in that lull you can't help but wonder. What if the storm lasts longer than the firewood pile? What if tomorrow's hunt is impossible? The animals all driven deep into their burrows? And what if these walls patched with mud and hope aren't enough after all? The fire snaps, startling the room back into motion. A child giggles nervously and someone strums the fiddle again, thin notes rising above the roar outside. The storm may rage, but inside you cling to small rituals, stories, songs, and the fragile glow of flame. Still, when the stew pot is lifted and the last scraps of salted meat are shared, a sobering thought creeps in. The food stores aren't bottomless, and surviving blizzards isn't just about warmth, it's about having something left to eat. Tomorrow you'll need to face that task, reaching for the salted meat that waits in stiff frozen slabs. The storm has quieted by morning, though not by much. Snow presses high against the cabin walls, windows blur with frost, and the door needs to be shoved open with your shoulder before it groans free. The world outside looks like a blank sheet of paper someone forgot to write on. But inside the problem isn't the snow, it's the hollow gnawing in your stomach. You turn toward the salted meat stores. They wait in the corner, stacked in small barrels, slabs crusted stiff with white. You pry one open, and the smell greets you, a pungent, briny wave that clings to your nose and insists on staying there. Salt was the frontier refrigerator, and while it worked, it didn't always invite enthusiasm. Imagine eating jerky that never ends tougher than leather and twice as salty. Still, in a world of blizzards, you don't get to be picky. Historians note that salted venison and pork were the backbone of many winter diets. Some families added dried beans, cornmeal, or whatever root vegetables survived the frost. Others relied almost entirely on salted slabs, gnawing them into chewable pieces with grim determination. Scholars debate how nutritious these rations really were. Some argue salted meat kept families alive but left them perpetually weak. Others claim that paired with porridge and broth it was enough to get by. Archaeological digs at old settlements show bone fragments and broken barrels, silent testimony to countless winter meals. You set a chunk near the fire, trying to thaw it enough to slice. The knife scrapes with a squeal, sparks of salt spraying like stubborn crystals. The slab resists every cut, making you feel like you're trying to carve a door out of stone. Eventually you manage to saw off a piece and drop it into a pot of water. The smell changes slowly from sharp brine to something almost appetizing. Steam curls upward, coating the cabin in the aroma of edible, but don't expect too much. The sensory world is alive again. The hiss of boiling water, the clink of the ladle against iron, the distant groan of snow shifting off the roof. The flavour, when you finally sip the broth, is salty beyond reason, yet warm, filling, undeniably comforting. You joke to yourself it tastes like survival seasoned with exhaustion. Neighbours accept their portions with nods of thanks. Children wrinkle their noses but eat anyway, each bite chased with a gulp of thin cider or melted snow. No one complains out loud because complaining doesn't add calories. Instead, the conversation drifts to lighter topics. Someone recalls a story about a settler who claimed his cow once fell asleep standing up in a snowbank, and everyone chuckles. Even if it's not quite funny, it's better than silence. But diaries tell a different story. Some entries confess the monotony of salted meat wore on families' spirits. Day after day, the same taste, the same texture, the same endless reminder of scarcity. Historians argue whether this monotony contributed to cabin fever, the restless irritability settlers described during long storms. Maybe it wasn't just the snow outside, but the taste inside that drove people to count knots in the walls just to stay sane. You look at the nearly empty pot sigh and cover it again with its lid. The meat has filled everyone's bellies for now, but tomorrow you'll be back at the barrels soaring boiling, hoping the supply lasts until spring. Salt preserves, but it doesn't multiply. As the fire dies low and you scrape your bowl clean, a new discomfort creeps in the straw mattress waiting in the corner, stiff, lumpy, and smelling faintly of damp. Food may keep you alive, but sleep, if you can get it, keeps you sane. And tonight you'll have to face the peculiar challenge of lying down on a bed made of reeds that seem intent on poking you awake. You drag yourself toward the corner of the cabin where the straw mattress waits, if you can even call it a mattress. It's more like a rectangular haystack that someone politely suggested you sleep on. The straw crunches as you sit poking through the thin sheet like an army of tiny cheerful daggers. You shift left then right, but every position ends with at least one stalk insisting on stabbing your ribs. Sleep may come, but comfort clearly stayed back east. Frontier families relied on straw reeds or dried grasses stuffed into sacks. They called them mattresses, though most of us today would call them mild torture devices. The material was cheap and plentiful. Every farm had straw, but it came with drawbacks. It flattened, quickly moulded if damp, and invited critters who thought you generously provided them an all-inclusive resort. Historians point out that settlers refreshed the stuffing every few weeks, tossing old straw outside where it froze into stiff golden lumps. Scholars still debate whether these mattresses were truly functional or whether people simply learned to ignore the discomfort. You lie back, the roof beams overhead creaking gently. The fire flickers on the wall, its smoke curling in lazy ribbons. The smell of straw mingles with smoke and salted meat still lingering in the air. Your senses are full, the dry rustle each time you move the itch along your wrist from stray fibres, the muffled sound of the wind pushing snow against the cabin walls. It's as if the mattress itself has joined the chorus of survival noises, singing its scratchy little part. You try a bit of humour to soften the reality. Ah yes, the deluxe frontier bed, you murmur to yourself, comes with a built-in back scratcher and complimentary hay fever. A neighbour chuckles from across the room, though you can't tell if it's sympathy or just delirium from exhaustion. The problem isn't just comfort, it's warmth. Straw insulates better than bare boards, but drafts sneak in anyway. You pile on quilts patched and mismatched their edges, frayed from years of use. Each one carries a faint story stitched by a grandmother back east traded for venison, with a neighbour salvaged from a wagon trunk. You spread them thick, layering fabric until the straw beneath almost disappears. For a moment nestled under the patchwork, you almost convince yourself you're cosy, but the cold is clever. It seeps in from below, finding seams pressing against your spine. Settlers often placed hot stones wrapped in cloth at their feet, makeshift bed warmers that cooled far too quickly. Diaries mention children huddling together like puppies, the family mattress less a bed than a communal survival strategy. Scholars note that warmth was often less about technology and more about sheer numbers. The more bodies, the more heat. Privacy took a back seat to not freezing. You close your eyes, listening. The mattress creaks when you breathe, the fire pops softly, and somewhere outside a branch snaps under the weight of snow. It is not silence, it's a lullaby of small steady sounds. For a while you let the rhythm of creaks and crackles trick you into drifting off. And then just as you're nearly asleep, a strange jingle stirs outside, faint metallic, muffled by snow but unmistakable. A bell. Not from your neighbours, they arrived last night. Not from livestock, you don't have any. You sit up, straw crunching loudly beneath you. The sound fades, then returns as if circling the cabin. Everyone else stirs eyes wide in the dim light. And you wonder in a storm this deep who or what would be wearing bells. You sit frozen, though not from the cold this time. The faint jingle drifts through the blizzard again, a rhythm so steady it feels almost deliberate. You press your ear to the wall, the log chilled against your skin, and hold your breath. The sound comes and goes, with the wind distant one moment, uncomfortably close the next. The others stir on their straw pallets, quilts pulled up to chins, eyes darting toward you as if you're supposed to explain. But you have no explanation, only that eerie music of metal striking metal muffled by snow. Historians note that frontier diaries occasionally mention strange nighttime noises during storms. Some settlers blame neighbours, some blamed wandering cattle, others chalked it up to the wind playing tricks. But one recurring detail is bells. Not church bells, not sleigh bells, but small jingles, the kind attached to harnesses or collars. Scholars still debate whether these accounts described actual animals, or whether the exhausted human mind simply conjured patterns out of chaos. After all, when you're snowbound for days, even the howling wind can start to sound like voices calling your name. You poke your head out the cabin door. The blast of air hits instantly cold, so sharp it stings your teeth. Snow whirls in angry spirals, stinging your cheeks, blinding your eyes. And there it is again, jingle paws jingle. You squint into the darkness but see nothing. Just a wall of white swallowing up everything a few feet from your boots. You shut the door quickly, fumbling to bar it against the wind, shaking your head, as if to toss away the sound. Inside, the lantern flickers. Shadows bend against the walls like tall figures leaning closer to listen. You joke weakly. Well, if Santa's lost, he's come a century too early. The neighbours chuckle nervously, more to chase away silence than because the joke landed. The children press closer to their parents, their straw mattresses squeaking beneath them. The sensory world is thick with tension. The constant groan of wind pressing on beams, the smell of smoke and straw, the occasional drip of snowmelt sneaking through the patched roof. Every sound is magnified now, as if the storm itself is listening for your reply. The fire snaps sharply and everyone startles at once. You laugh softly, shaking your head, but even your laugh feels borrowed, stretched thin over worry. Scholarly debate continues. Were these accounts exaggerations, products of sleeplessness and superstition? Or was there something out there, stray cattle perhaps, or sled dogs roaming in search of warmth? Whatever the explanation, the diaries agree on. One thing, the bells always faded, drifting into silence as if carried away by the storm. And so, after a long stretch of waiting, the sound dwindles again, leaving only the familiar howl of wind. Relief is slow to return. One by one, neighbours settle back down, though sleep does not come easily. You lie on the straw mattress again, pulling the quilt high, trying not to imagine footsteps circling just beyond the walls. Eventually the rhythm of the storm lulls you, your eyelids heavy. The bells may have gone, but they leave behind a residue of unease like a dream you can't quite shake. Still, tomorrow brings new tasks. Roofs patched, gaps sealed, neighbours reassured the work is never done. And as the storm eases for now, you'll finally have a chance to dream not of mysterious bells, but of simpler comforts. Because in the morning your world will be lit not just by the hearth, but by the fragile glow of lanterns fighting off the endless dark. Morning creeps in slowly, though you wouldn't know it by the sky. The storm still lingers, a flat grey curtain that erases the horizon. Inside the cabin, light seeps thinly through cracks in the roof, but it's not enough. Shadows stretch long, the corners of the room dense with gloom, and so you reach for the lantern. It's a humble thing, an iron-frame glass cloudy from soot wick sitting in a shallow pool of precious oil. You strike a spark, coax the flame alive, and suddenly the room warms not in temperature but in spirit. Golden light spills across quilts and beams, flickering like it wants to dance. The children sigh with relief, neighbours relax their shoulders, and for a moment you could almost forget the storm outside. Lanterns were lifelines for frontier families. Without them, nights stretched endlessly, broken only by firelight. Imagine 12, 14 hours of darkness, punctuated by creaks and whispers from the woods. A lantern gave shape to space. Its glow turned a drafty hut into something resembling home. Historians note that settlers often prioritized oil for lanterns over other comforts. The flame was more than light, it was reassurance. Scholars still debate how much oil was used for necessity versus morale. Some argue families rationed tightly, while others point to records of neighbours sharing reserves, suggesting the light was too important to skimp on. The sensory details are vivid. The lantern glass grows warm beneath your fingers. Smoke curls inside, thin and bluish, while outside the wind howls. Each flicker of flame bends shadows across the wall, transforming ordinary objects into towering shapes. For children, those shadows were both entertainment and terror. One diary mentions siblings giggling as they made shadow bears on the wall, only to sleep poorly when the storm's groans made those shadows look far too alive. You too watch the shifting shapes. A beam becomes a bent figure. A coat on a peg looks like someone leaning silently in the corner. You laugh softly at yourself. Shadow puppets, Frontier Edition, but you still tug the quilt closer. Humour helps, but shadows have a way of sneaking into the imagination, especially when you're tired. The lantern light also reveals the state of the cabin more clearly. You notice gaps you missed during yesterday's chinking snow, edging through like unwelcome lace. You see the uneven roof above sagging just slightly with heavy drifts. You sigh, realizing more repairs wait, though for tonight you choose to ignore them. Let the storm rage, your lantern makes the space bearable, even cozy. And then just as everyone begins to settle, you hear it again. The faintest metallic jingle muffled by snow carried on the wind. This time the lantern light makes it worse. Every shadow seems to lean toward the sound as if listening. The neighbours glance at each other, eyes flicking nervously. But the bells do not grow louder. They hover on the edge of hearing a tease of sound that might be real, might be imagined. And then they fade once more, leaving only the crackle of fire and the hiss of oil. You shake your head, smile tiredly, and tell yourself it's just the wind playing tricks. But deep down, you can't help thinking the Frontier had more mysteries than any diary could capture. Tomorrow you'll set the lantern aside and think of warmer things like the food and drink that carried people through endless winters. Because before the next blizzard, you'll need more than light. You'll need the strength that only hot steaming bowls can provide. The lantern burns low, but the stew pot waits to be filled again. Because no matter how smoky, drafty or creaky the cabin may be, hunger always returns. This morning you lift the lid and peer inside, only a few scraps cling to the bottom. The salty broth from yesterday is gone, absorbed by weary bellies. So as the wind groans and snow creaks off the roof, your mind drifts to trading posts, the Frontier's answer to grocery stores, though far less reliable. You imagine trudging there, snowshoes strapped on boots, wet and stiff, dragging a sled or pack just for the chance to barter. What do you bring? Pelts from last season's hunt, maybe, or a jar of syrup, or even iron nails if you're lucky enough to have them. In exchange, you might get flour-dried beans, or if the gods are kind, molasses. Historians describe these posts as lifelines, especially during long winters. Yet scholars argue about their reach. Some claim families depended on them heavily. Others insist most settlers were too isolated to rely on such luxuries. Archaeological digs reveal traces of imported goods, ceramic cups, glass bottles alongside simple hand-carved tools, proving that even the remotest cabins weren't entirely cut off from the world. As you stir a new pot of thin porridge, the smell rises, bland, starchy and faintly smoky from the soot that always sneaks into food cooked over an open flame. You try to make it sound more appealing. Rustic Frontier oatmeal, you whisper to yourself, as if branding could make it gourmet. A neighbour laughs, though they still eye the pot with suspicion. The sensory details are humble. The scrape of the ladle against iron, the hiss of steam on the lid, the creak of wooden bowls being passed around. Children slurp, adults chew quietly, the rhythm of survival carried in spoons and sighs. It isn't abundance, but it is enough. And enough has always been the Frontier's favourite word. You lean back, belly no longer aching, and let your mind wander. What would you ask for at a trading post today? A sack of sugar, candied ginger coffee. Oh, coffee, how diaries praise it, even when it was weak, gritty and boiled 3 times too many. Settlers called it comfort in a cup, though half the time it was more like disappointment in muddy water. Still, even a hint of the aroma must have felt like luxury in a snow-locked cabin. Scholars debate whether food monotony shaped the rhythm of Frontier winters. Did endless salted meat and porridge dull the mind, making days blur together? Or did scarcity sharpen creativity, encouraging families to experiment with whatever they had? Roots, herbs, berries dried and hidden in sacks. Perhaps both were true. Perhaps the story of winter food is less about flavour and more about endurance. As you lick the last bit of porridge from your spoon, you glance at the frost creeping across the window. The blizzard outside has softened for now. The lantern flickers gently. For the moment, the cabin is quiet, full, almost peaceful. And yet you know this calm won't last. Because when the storm returns, and it will, the dogs outside will sense it before you do. Their whines will break the silence sharp and insistent. And when sled dogs start complaining, you know something peculiar is on the way. The cabin has finally settled into its rhythm fire crackling bowls, emptied quilts piled high, when a new sound interrupts the lull. A low restless whine seeps in through the doorframe. At first you think it's the wind slipping into a new key, but then it comes again sharper, rising into a yelp. The sled dog outside is not pleased. You push the door open, snow tumbling in around your boots, and peer into the pale, swirling world. The dog is there, fur-frosted white paws shifting impatiently against the snow. It scratches at the wooden frame not to come in, but to tell you something. You don't speak dog, but the message is clear: the storm is not done. Sled dogs were companions and workers, sometimes both at once. Historians point out that frontier families often relied on them to haul wood carry supplies or break paths through the snow. Scholars debate whether dogs were truly essential in every settlement or more common in northern regions where deep snow made other transport impossible. Diaries describe them with affection, though also with exasperation. Dogs that howled through the night, chewed harness straps, or ate food meant for humans. Still, no one could deny their instincts. A restless dog often meant weather was about to turn. The sensory world sharpens as you watch it pour the snow. The air stings your face, the flakes cling to your lashes, and the muffled crunch of the dog's steps punctuates the silence between gusts. You catch the faint smell of fur mixed with frost, that strange, musky scent that only comes from an animal that's lived in the snow longer than you have. You crouch, patting its head. The ears twitch, back eyes squinting as the wind lashes across both of you. The animal leans into you for a moment, then pulls away, pacing again, restless, as if the blizzard were an opponent it could outweight by sheer stubbornness. You can't help muttering, well, at least someone's taking this storm personally. Back inside, the neighbours exchange looks. One murmurs that dogs don't whine without reason. Another shrugs, pointing out that animals also whine for scraps of salted meat. Still unease settles like frost over the room. Frontier lore is full of such warnings: dogs barking before snow slides, horses shying before winds shift. Scholars still argue whether this was genuine instinct or simply hindsight dressed up as wisdom. But the consistency of the stories makes you wonder. The fire spits sparks, rising like restless thoughts. The dog outside whines again, scratching harder nails, rasping against wood. You feel it in your bones. The storm is circling back heavier than before. Sleep will not come easily tonight. And just when you start to tuck yourself deeper under the quilt, the sound outside changes. Not a whine now, but a sharp bark, urgent, carrying over the roar of wind. Everyone sits upright, straw mattresses rustling, eyes wide. The dog paces in frantic circles, warning you in the only language it knows. Because this time the storm doesn't just sound worse, it feels alive. And tomorrow, when the roof begins to sag beneath the weight of snow, you'll understand exactly what the dog was trying to say. Quilts, and then more quilts, and then the quilt you swore you'd retired last spring but dragged back out because tonight the cabin creaks in that particular way that says the roof is carrying more snow than your nerves can carry. Worry. You feel it in the rafters, an old tired groan that travels down the posts and into the floorboards. You do the only immediate thing you can do: you add layers. If winter is going to pile itself on your house, you'll pile cloth on yourself, a quiet arms race fought in stitches. You spread the first quilt, coarse, heavy, a patchwork of odd rectangles cut from shirts and skirts that lived better lives than you're currently having. The seams are thick beneath your fingertips, stiff with age, the hand of someone long gone still palpable in each stubborn stitch. Over that goes a lighter quilt, tiny triangles in a pattern that almost makes sense if you squint through smoke. Then a tied comforter, big tufts of yarn pocking the surface like little snowdrifts that remembered to be warm. You're basically creating a frontier-weighted blanket, except yours chirps when straw shifts underneath. Frontier families didn't treat quilts as decor, they treated them like infrastructure. You hang one over the door to kill the draft, whose personality could politely be described as over-familiar. Another gets tacked along the north wall, transforming the log surface into a soft, muffled barrier. A third hangs from the rafters like a drooping curtain to trap heat near the hearth, a kind of early zoning system for your open-plan 12 by 14-foot palace. You've invented climate control with patchwork and hope. If your modern friends ask, tell them it's artisanal insulation. Historians love quilts not only because they survived, but because they speak. They catalogue scarcity wool next to linen next to a scrap of calico that must have travelled a very long way. They whisper names of patterns, bear's paw, log cabin on the nose, yes flying geese broken dishes. Scholars still argue how widespread certain designs really were on the far frontier. Some claim the famous patterns are 19th century publishing, Darling's retrofitted backward, while diaries suggest most quilts were simply whatever geometry the maker could manage after a 12-hour day of not freezing. There's debate too over the phrase sleep tight. Was it from tightening bed ropes under the straw tick or just a cheerful wish? The evidence is mixed. You tighten the ropes anyway, then decide the wish can't hurt. You run a palm over the topmost quilt and feel the slight waxy drag of lanolin that never quite washed from recycled wool. Textiles carry scent like memory, a hint of smoke, a little salt from sweat. The ghost of lye soap, a bare whisper of old cedar. Somewhere a corner still smells like the meadow it used to be. The sensory chorus shifts not the sharp song of the wind now, but the hush of fabric, the soft shush-shush, as layers settle the faint flossy rasp of cotton, batting shifting inside its casing. The bell motif is gone. Tonight your soundtrack is thread. Someone suggests dragging the quilting frame out from under the bed, the one that takes up half the room when assembled, turning your home into a textile ship's rigging. You oblige because busyness dilutes worry. You lash for poles, stretch a new top across, and begin the slow, meditative stab and pull that quiets the mind. The needle clicks against your thimble, a tiny metronome for a longer song. A child falls asleep on the straw fingers curled around a spool like it's a toy. The dog gives one last suspicious huff at the door and finally settles ribs rising and falling beneath a scrap of old blanket. Quirky tidbit time when batting was scarce. Some families stuffed quilts with anything that trapped air cattail fluff-carded hair from shedding animals, even soft paper. There are tales, half legend, half ledger of paper-piece tops, hand-basted around newspaper templates that later stayed inside so that a century on you can unpick a seam and read someone's market prices as if the quilt had been keeping the minutes. Historians still argue whether these paper ghosts were common on the far frontier or more of a parlour habit in towns, but the romance is irresistible, your warmth lined in old headlines. You shift beneath the growing hill of quilts and finally feel heat pool at your knees. You tuck the edges under your feet in a practiced move that would win awards if the frontier handed those out. Someone jokes softly that the family wardrobe has been promoted to roof supplement. You smirk and add, and if the roof collapses, at least we'll be stylishly layered. It gets a tired laugh, the kind where everyone exhales smiles into their collars, because the joke is half shield, half gratitude. There's comfort in the workmanship. Every uneven stitch declares someone cared enough to keep you warm. You trace a seam and think about the hands that made it, calloused, soap-dried hands that pricked themselves and swore under their breath, then kept sewing. Scholarly debate-aside quilts collapse the distance between seasons and selves. You're wrapped not just in cloth, but in accumulated problem-solving cut, save, mend, repeat. It feels like a thesis on frontier philosophy argument stated in cotton. Still, the practical mind won't be soothed entirely. Heat wants to rise, quilts want to slump. You improvise a canopy by tying one corner to a rafter with twine, then weighting the opposite corners with flat stones wrapped in cloth, so they won't bruise shins in the night. The result is a low, warm tent inside your house, an inner weather immune to the outer kind. If children stir, you hear the whisper of cloth, and the small smack of lips as they resettle. If adults shift, you hear the quiet complaint of bed ropes tightening. The fire gives a polite crackle, no longer the whole story, just a supporting actor to your cotton architecture. Not all quilts were stitched in solitude. Winter brought quilting bees, neighbours arriving with needles, gossip, and a pie someone managed to keep from freezing. There's debate about how often such gatherings happened in sparsely settled regions, but the memory persists because it's irresistible. A room of hands travelling in rows, conversation braided like seams, the social fabric literally becoming a fabric. You can almost hear it now, the soft chorus of voices, the small gasp when a needle finds skin, the shared when someone opens a jar of precious preserves, like a hushed barn raising but for warmth. Another joke sneaks out as you tuck an edge under your shoulder. Congratulations, you now subscribe to Layer Crate monthly delivery of whatever we've already worn through. It earns a grin. The lightness is small, but it's enough to loosen jawlines. You let your eyes droop, listen to the cabin with its new cloth lungs breathing slower. The roof still mutters overhead, but the sound is buffered now, filtered through quilts, and calmed to something you can almost mistake for a heavy blanket settling on a sleeping back. For a last check, you slip a hand out into the colder air and touch the wall quilt. The logs beyond are chilled like old iron. The quilt face is merely cool. That difference inches only feels like a chasm you've bridged with thread. You return your hand to the warm cave you've made and feel the heat follow your fingers, back obedient as a cat. Of course, all this warmth comes with an invoice. A heavy stack of quilts can snuff your awareness as efficiently as it holds in heat. Fires misbehave, embers wander, sparks get curious. Someone has to keep watch to turn logs to listen, not to bells tonight, but to timbers and the soft sigh of coals. You think of the phrase night watch and realize it sounds grander than the reality it's just staying awake when you'd rather not trading an hour of sleep for the rest of the house's safety. You settle deeper, face half buried, promising yourself you'll take the first turn. The quilts press a gentle, persuasive argument for forgetting that promise. You nearly do. But then a bead of resin in the fire pops a tiny star skittering onto the hearthstone, and your eyes open all the way clear and careful. Because as warm as you finally are, the next duty is even stranger than adding another blanket. It's learning to doze with one ear on the embers, one on the rafters, and both hands ready. Night falls heavy again, and with it comes your next strange assignment, the night watch. In the cabin, everyone else is bundled beneath quilts, their breathing soft and steady straw crunching whenever someone rolls over. The fire has burned down to a bed of red coals glowing faintly like a secret heartbeat. And here you sit, shoulders hunched, stick in hand, prodding the embers to keep them alive. Being on watch isn't glamorous. It's the art of being too cold and too awake while everyone else snores. You lean close, listening to the crackle of the coals, feeling their dry heat on your face. Each spark that leaps upward is both a comfort and a threat. You need them to flare but not to wander. Because one spark too curious could turn your hard-earned shelter into ash before dawn. No pressure. Historians note that the night watch was common on the frontier, especially in the deep of winter. Families took turns poking the fire, keeping the cabin from dipping into unbearable cold. Some journals describe it as meditative, an hour or two of quiet thought. Others confess it was torture fighting sleep while counting minutes. Scholars still debate whether families truly kept this routine every night, or whether that claim was romanticized later. Archaeological evidence soot stains high on cabin rafters. Charred patches on floorboards suggest fires often got away, meaning someone probably did doze off. You shift your weight quilt wrapped around your shoulders like a cape. The cabin is full of sensory whispers, the soft sigh of sleepers, the occasional whimper from the dog curled at the door, the faint hiss of sap burning inside the logs. Outside, the storm has eased, but not entirely. The wind still brushes against the roof, whistling through the eaves like a flute being played badly. You sit and listen, ears straining for anything unusual. Your thoughts wander. The flames remind you of other night shifts in modern life, working late at a desk refreshing your email at 2 a.m. Except here, the stakes are less about deadlines and more about not freezing to death. You smirk, whispering graveyard shift, then laugh at your own pun, literally a shift to keep everyone out of the graveyard. The joke falls flat in the empty room, but it helps you stay awake. To keep busy, you poke the coals. Sparks drift upward, tiny fireflies caught in a draft. You place another log watch. The flames catch, hear the wood groan and snap. The smell of pine sap thickens, sweet and sticky, coating the back of your throat. Shadows lengthen again, bending across the walls in strange slow dances. You trace them with your eyes, trying not to imagine figures standing silently in the corners. Scholars argue whether fire-watching bred superstition. Diaries hint at visions, faces in smoke, whispers in the crackle. Was it imagination, or exhaustion, or something stranger you don't know? What you do know is that as the hours pass, the line between dream and waking blurs. Every creak of the rafters makes you sit straighter. Every gust of wind sounds like a step in the snow. And then just as your eyelids sag dangerously, a sharp pop jolts you awake. A coal leaps out, skittering across the stone hearth. You scramble, slap it down with your stick and sigh in relief. The cabin stays intact, but your heart races and your watch is far from over. For now the embers glow steady again, promising warmth until dawn. Yet tomorrow will bring its own peculiar trial laundry day, when even washing shirts becomes an ordeal in ice and wind. Because on the frontier even clean clothes froze stiff before they ever dried. Laundry day arrives like an appointment you didn't make but can't miss. The basket waits by the door, shirt stiff with smoke socks, plotting mutiny, a towel that crunches when you bend it. You eye the heap and think, Surely we can invent a fashion trend called sootcore and skip this, but no. The cabin smells like wood smoke and salted meat, and even the dog has started giving you judgy looks. You pull on your mittens and step outside into a world made of glass breath and squeaking snow. Frontier laundry in winter is less a chore and more a physics experiment conducted by sleep-deprived optimists. You haul your iron pot to the hearthside shovel in snow and wait as it sulks its way into water. Each scoop hisses and shrinks like it's reconsidering its life choices. When enough has melted, you stir in lye soap shaved from a gritty bar, the flakes sliding into a cloudy swirl. The scent is sharp, clean in theory, caustic in practice, and it nips the inside of your nose. Soap today comes in cheerful bottles promising lavender fields. Your soap promises competence and burns your fingers to prove it. You dunk the first shirt. The fabric drinks, the heat goes limp and sullen, and turns the water into a tea of sweat, soot and regret. You scrub at the collar against a washboard until your arms complain, then wring it hard enough to make your ancestors proud. The shirt wheezes out a brown ribbon, and you nod like a stern coach who approves of this performance. There's a rhythm to it. Plunge, rub, slap, ring. Steam beads on your eyelashes. Your cheeks sting with the near boil, then sting again 4 steps later when the wind reminds you who's in charge. Historians still argue whether frontier families did large winter washings or limped by with spot cleaning until spring. Diaries show both some households braved a weekly boil-up short sessions, small loads rapid freezing. Others saved the great wash for thaws, living meanwhile in a compromise state called wear the least dirty thing. Archaeological evidence, soap shards, laundry paddles and ash residues near hearths suggests routine winter washing happened more than nostalgia grants, but likely in bite-sized batches. The debate bubbles like your pot, constant, a little scalding and not fully settled. You carry the dripping shirt to the line and feel winter's party trick in real time. It goes from steaming to glassy in a breath, and then in a marvel you'd pay to see at a science museum the fabric stiffens. Not metaphorically, literally. You drape sleeve over line. Sleeve says I am now a polite plank. By the time you return with the second shirt, the first is making a papery sound when the wind flicks it. You knock a corner with your knuckles and it tinks. You grin despite yourself. Okay, that's neat. Laundry sculptures. Modern art, you murmur. The dog sneezes in agreement. Sensory anchors shift from smoke and embers to water and ice. Buckets clank with a dull ring. The line creaks under crystalline weight. Your fingertips damp through the mittens, find a new vocabulary for temperature scald sting numb, and the special static of cold nylon across raw skin. Each shirt you pin hisses as it sheds the last of its steam, then hushes as ice takes it. The world smells of iron and soap and the sterile sweetness of snow. Even sound travels differently, far the cleaner. A crow barks from the woods, and you hear the silvery echo long after the bird has gone silent. You keep a kettle near the fire to freshen water when it cools. Time becomes circuits fire to pot to basin to line to wind. You slip on the patch of ice you made 3 trips ago, catch yourself with a noise that is mostly dignity, leaving the building, and then laugh. Frontier Pilates you announce and promise yourself an imaginary class punch card. 10 washes earns a cookie. No cookies exist. You take a breath of mint cold air instead. Quirky tidbit time, some households blew their wash with indigo, or laundry bluing to make whites look less yellow in winter's unforgiving light. Others swished a rusty nail in the pot iron, supposedly brightened linen, or at least gave it character. There are even scattered references to tossing a potato into the boil to soften hard water. Historians still argue whether these hacks were common practice, or the pet tricks of a few enthusiastic washers who happened to keep diaries. Either way, you find yourself eyeing a spare nail and thinking, why not Professor Laundry? You do not throw the potato. Potatoes are sacred stew currency. As the line fills, the cabin transforms its perimeter into a gallery of frozen flags. Shirts stand like polite soldiers at attention. Socks become short horns. A towel arches into a perfect sail. The sun presses a weak smudge through the cloud deck, and for a moment the ice along the hems sparks with points of light, a string of quiet bells made of shine. You remember the nights of actual bells, those mysterious jingles wrapped in wind, and feel a soft prickling down your neck. You decide these bells are better bells you can see, bells that don't wander the dark edges of your imagination. Scholars debate the social choreography of laundry. Did families wash together, neighbours pooling labour around a steaming kettle, Or did winter isolate chores into solo grinds? The record splits again along geography and chance. In tight clusters of cabins, women wrote about wash mornings where jokes rose with steam and someone always burned a sleeve. In lonelier places, entries grow terse washed, froze, dried by fire. You today stand somewhere between a neighbour swings by to help bring trades 2 extra clothespins for a promise of stew later, and leaves a handprint of wet on your mitten that turns to lace. Companionship measured in laundry, not bad. You bring in the first pieces when they reach the brittle phase between wet and dry, what you'll call crackle ready. Inside the air fogs as ice surrenders. The cabin becomes a humid cave. Windows bloom with fern-like frost that keeps its beauty even as drops begin to patter on the sill. You string a second line above the hearth, a ridiculous spiderweb where sleeves brush rafters and socks swing like pendulums. Everyone ducks and laughs because there is no graceful way to live under a ceiling of flapping shirts. New decor, you announce Scandinavian industrial barn chic. The room votes to ignore you and be warm. Steam loosens the soap's sharpness into something almost pleasant. Clean wool, hot cotton, a shy sweetness of dried grass revived inside fibres. The dog crawls beneath the fluttering towels as if this is his private theatre. Children giggle when a drip hits a nose. Quilts drink the humidity and puff slightly grateful. The music of the house changes again, drip hiss drip, a gentle metronome for chores. You spare a thought for hands. Lie leaves them tender, and raw winter air chaps them into maps of tiny canyons, and the work insists on repetition, grip, twist, pin. Frontier diaries don't romanticize this. They list cracked knuckles and bleeds at night. Yet in the same breath they mention the pride of a clean line in January as if saying even now we keep order. Scholars sometimes miss that small doctrine of dignity. You don't. You rub a smear of tallow into your knuckles and decide that feeling like a functioning person is worth a little sting. By afternoon, shirts lean warm and willing toward your hands instead of snapping at them. You fold while they're still faintly damp at the cuffs so they'll finish dry by the fire. Each stack is a square of truce with winter. You set them beside the quilts and watch the little cloud that rises off the pile, a ghost of the morning's breath returning to the air. A joke to end the monotony. Congratulations, your wardrobe is now shelf-stable. Someone snorts. Someone else asks if socks count as provisions. You decree that if anyone eats a sock, they earn dish duty for a month. Order restored. As twilight presses its blue thumb against the window, the last of the drip slows. The line above the hearth sways almost imperceptibly, a tide too small to see unless you're tired enough to notice everything. You feel the room's shoulders drop. Laundry done. The day gave you cold and sting and a comical amount of steam, but it also gave you rhythm, and rhythm is a kind of shelter the wind can't take. You glance at the door. The weather has cleared, but the night will sharpen again. Clean sleeves wait by the pegs, ready for dawn, ready for more wood, more snow, more persistence. You stretch your fingers, flex the ache away and listen. Not bells, not storm, just the soft ticking of cooling iron and the tiny satisfied sigh of cloth at rest. And yet, even as calm creeps in, a familiar thought lifts its head. Your almanac is tucked under the breadboard, and the page you dog-eared promised a change in wind, maybe more snow by moonrise. But the old rhymes don't always agree, and what they suggest next is stranger than you'd like to admit. Morning brings porridge, thick, steaming and bland enough to make you grateful for the faint hint of smoke drifting in from the hearth. You scoop a ladleful into a wooden bowl, stir it with a spoon that has seen better decades, and lift it toward your face. Steam fogs your lashes, the warmth chasing away the sting left by another icy night. It isn't gourmet, not even close, but in this season it is comfort disguised as mush. Frontier porridge was often oats or cornmeal boiled with water, sometimes with milk if livestock survived the storm. A pinch of salt, a spoon of molasses if fortune smiled, maybe a knob of butter when cows were generous. Each addition turned a monotone into a miracle. Historians point out that porridge was breakfast, lunch, and occasionally supper, a monotonous chorus of slop, stir, swallow. Scholars debate how much variety frontier families really managed. Some diaries mention berries dried and tossed in for cheer. Others admit plain gruel for weeks at a time. Archaeologists have even found traces of charred grains in old hearthstones, proof that even the simplest food could betray you if neglected. You blow on the surface, then take a bite. The taste is thick, slightly salty, and it clings to your tongue like it doesn't want to leave. A joke springs to mind breakfast that sticks to your ribs because it's actively trying to glue itself there. You swallow, chuckle softly, and take another spoonful. The dog perks up hopeful for a taste, but you shake your head. Porridge may be boring, but it is yours. The sensory anchors come alive again, the hiss of the pot as bubbles rise and burst the faint wooden creak, as spoons scrape bowls, the earthy smell of cornmeal mingling with smoke. Outside, snow shifts with a hollow slump sliding off the roof, punctuating your meal with nature's own percussion. Every sound reminds you that while storms may rage, humans always return to the same rhythm eat, warm, endure. Neighbours sip their portions quietly. One hums, another mutters that it tastes better than yesterday's broth, and everyone nods in agreement. There's a solidarity in this monotony. If you must eat the same thing daily, at least you do it together. Diaries often describe the morning meal as a communal anchor when families brace themselves for chores with bowls in hand. Scholars argue that porridge's very blandness was a virtue requiring no imagination, no distraction leaving energy for survival. Still, boredom creeps in. You stir the last bit of porridge, staring at its slow spiral, and dream of foods far away, fresh bread, crisp apples, even buttered biscuits. You sigh, scraping the bottom, and remind yourself that someday spring will bring more than grain and salt. For now, you make do, and as you set your bowl aside, you reach for the almanac tucked near the hearth. The old worn book promises wisdom about the seasons, sunspots, moon phases, animal behaviour. Some rhymes claim to predict storms before they come, but as you flip to the marked page, you notice something odd. The predictions don't quite agree. You slide the almanac from beneath the breadboard like you're consulting an old friend who sometimes lies. The cover is softened by grease, and years the corners bent into patient dog ears that point to storms past. When you open it, the paper makes a dry whisper like reeds in thaw, your new soundtrack for the morning. Not wind, not water, but the quiet rustle of pages and the tiny scratch your thumb makes along the edge. The ink is brown-black, a little blotchy where someone dripped stew or tallow. Tables march down the page with small bossy numbers, moon phases, sunrise guesses, likelihood of snow, and those poetic notes that pretend to be science. If the oak holds leaves, winter holds storms. You skim with a healthy skepticism that would make any modern weather app proud. The almanac says fair skies. Your window says a sky the colour of old pewter. Fair pewter close cousins only if you live inside an optimistic poem. Frontier families swore by these books and also swore at them. Diaries hum with their presents tucked near the hearth, carried to the barn, loaned to neighbours, who returned them with a new smear of bacon grease and a tale about last year's eclipse. Historians love almanacs because they're time capsules, the ads, the seed charts, the jokes, that were only funny if you'd been awake since 4 a.m. Scholars still argue how accurate the long-range forecasts ever were. Some claim the books leaned on memory and common sense dressed in ephemerides. Others insist the mixture of astronomy observation and folklore did better than chance. There's even debate over how many households had one in the deep frontier. The evidence fragments of almanacs stuffed into chinks, repurposed as kindling or quilt paper weather prophecy, reborn as insulation. You read a rhyme aloud because part of the charm is the way it sounds when spoken into a cold room. When halo rings the winter moon, expect the drift to visit soon. Someone from their quilt murmurs that last night's moon wore a ring you could have hung a coat on. Another flips to a different page and discovers a contradictory couplet about red dawns bringing clear days. You add congratulations, we've invented forecast roulette. A child giggles. The dog yawns like a skeptic. The sensory anchors layer themselves, the thin scratch of your nail tracing a column, the faint oil-slick gleam where fingers have polished margins, the dry paper smell that's half dust, half smoke. When you lift a corner to turn the page, it resists with the soft stickiness of cold and old grease. You listen as the page lets go shuff, and for a second the room feels like a library built of logs and quilts, wisdom bound in twine. A quirky tidbit surfaces from the notes someone penciled years ago in the margin. First snow on St. Martin's Day, geese fly low sour milk storm. Geese you believe. Sour milk you're less sure about as meteorological proof, though you concede you've seen milk curdle from sheer attitude. Another scribble. If cats wash face wind. If rooster crows at night storm. If neighbour insists on visiting with fiddle, just because blizzard for certain. You underline the rooster with a grin and declare new official index 1 rooster equals 1 storm, 2 roosters equals dance night. Scholars still puzzle over how much frontier weather sense came from observing animals versus repeating pleasing rhymes. Some entries mention cows facing away from the wind before a change dog's digging at doors, which your dog did loudly, and crows flying low when air thickens before snow. There's even a bit of science behind it. Pressure shifts ice crystals the way sound carries in cold. But then the text veers into folklore. When smoke falls, snow calls. When beams creak, rafters speak. Here you are listening to both the smoke drifting lazy, the beams muttering nodding as if the house itself has joined the forecast team. You turn to the moon chart, tonight waxing gibbous if the cloud curtain will be kind enough to part. The almanac says warmer winds may follow, which in frontier dialect means the air will rise from injurious to merely insulting. There's a faint pencil X beside next week's stack wood high. You tap the mark and think of the drifts that turned laundry into sculpture. You think of the dog circling of the roof, groaning like an old man getting out of a chair. You don't need perfect accuracy. You need permission to keep preparing. The almanac grants it. You set the book on your knee and look around. Lantern off hearth, steady quilt slumped into calm. The room smells like porridge and paper and a ghost of pine. Outside, the world holds its breath. This is what the almanac does best. It gives the quiet a shape, a schedule, a narrative that makes endurance feel like participation. Instead of wait and hope, you can say we're in the third quarter of the moon time to hang an extra quilt. A joke rises as jokes do when the work pauses. If the almanac promises sunshine, I'll bring the sunglasses we don't own. It earns a few sleepy smiles. Someone suggests you write your own frontier forecast: Monday snow, Tuesday still snow, Wednesday ambitious snow. You dip the stub of a pencil, and in the back page where past you has scrawled a list of debts, and a stew recipe you add. If the kettle hums and the logs complain, step lightly, the drifts plan again. You impress yourself with the poetry until a sleeve brushes the stew note, and you remember that practical beats poetic when dinner is at stake. Quirky footnote number 2, many almanacs doubled as notebooks, which is why their surviving copies are part prophecy, part ledger, part gossip. Margins host seed counts, infant weights, a borrowed axe never returned circled twice, and once in faint shy script C. Promise to play the fiddle when the thaw comes. It feels illicit to read, but the book lives here. It's part of your house now, its thin paper adding a second skin to your winter. Historians still argue if this domestic scribbling devalued or enriched the text. You decide it did the only thing that matters, it made the book honest. You close your eyes and lean the book to your chest. The paper cools with the room's breath. Your fingers ride the spine's ridges, counting them like a rosary you don't quite know the prayers for. When you set the almanac back in its nook, you do so with more tenderness than a bundle of paper usually gets. It has told you little you didn't already suspect. But that's not why people kept it close. They kept it because a page you can hold is a small victory over a sky you can't. You stand and listen. The house answers in its vocabularies a faint tick of cooling iron by the hearth, a soft seat of straw sigh, as someone shifts the far-off hush of snow settling against the outside wall like a tired shoulder. The wind gathers itself somewhere, then slips a testing finger under the door quilt. The flame lowers, then steadies like a nod. You step to the window and wipe a small circle with the heel of your hand. Your breath veils the view, then clears. The trees are motionless, but high above the clouds hurry low, fast heavy as rolled wool. You don't need a rhyme for that. You can feel it in your teeth, in the soles of your feet, in the way the dog gets up and turns once twice, then stares at the latch. The almanac promised fair tending toward change. The sky edits fair and underlines change 3 times. You draw the curtain and add 1 more log, then 2, then a small wedge, because thrift and fear are cousins. You touch the almanac once more as you pass the briefest patter habit already, and think of everyone who has done this before you, who flipped a page and found courage disguised as a chart. Scholars can keep their debates, you have your own verdict. The book is part tool, part talisman, and as the day leans toward its blue hour, you hear the first dry rattle of hard snow grains against the roof, sleety insistent the sound of a hand at a drum. The dog lifts his head. The house seems to inhale, you breathe with it, because the next entry in your real-time forecast is not a rhyme, not a table, but a roar, and when the wind returns with teeth, you'll need every stitch and every habit you've learned to hold. But even that may not keep the rafters from groaning in a voice you haven't heard yet. The first pellets sound like spilled grain on a drumhead ticking sly, not yet the full punctuation of real snow. You hold your breath as if quiet could persuade the sky to be reasonable, and then the sound rounds out. Pellets become flakes, flakes become clumps, and the roof begins its old tired conversation with gravity. A low moan travels the rafters and sets your jaw on edge. You've lived with creaks all winter, but this voice is different, heavier, older, like an ox leaning into a yoke that might not hold. You move without thinking, quilt off your shoulders, boots on mittens yanked. The dog is already standing head-angled toward the roof as if he can hear where weight gathers. You unlatch the door, and the storm pushes in like an impatient customer. The first breath of air is sharp enough to file your thoughts. The yard you stamped flat yesterday has vanished under a new white sheet, and the world beyond the first fir tree is gone. Any neighbours out there might as well be on the moon, which tonight has the courtesy to remain invisible. Your pole, really a stripped sapling with a forked end, waits by the doorway. You step into the drift that politely pretends to be a step and jam the pole upward along the eaves. Snow sloughs away with a reluctant shudder thudding beside you in a generous heap that immediately tries to reclaim your shins. The rhythm arrives, lift, scrape, whumph. Lift, scrape, whumph. Each slide takes a fraction of weight off the roof, a fraction of worry off your chest. Historians, bless them, will later argue whether families deliberately let a skin of snow stay for insulation a poor person's thatch, versus scraping it clean to dodge a collapse. Diaries make the case both ways. Left the white quilt on the roof for warmth, sits beside spent the night scraping lest the rafters crack. Scholars point to pitch. Steep roofs shed better, shallow roofs hoarded disaster. Archaeologists wave charred and broken timbers at the debate. Snow was often the prelude to fire and ruin when chimneys loosened and sparks met sagging beams. Tonight you side with the scrapers. Poetry can keep its white quilt. Your beams need a diet. The sensory anchors grab hold. The pole's bark bites your palm through the mitten, rough and reassuring. Ice dust sprinkles your face whenever the load breaks free, a sting like salt in winter's vocabulary. The house gives you feedback through your feet, that faint, relieved shift when a burden lifts. Inside the door, warmth fogs your lashes, and then the wind steals it again, a metronome for haste. Somewhere in your head, a tune starts keeping time with the scrape, some half-remembered fiddle line from a night that wasn't this one. You hum 2 bars, then snort at yourself blizzard jazzercise. If you ever open a gym membership, comes with a free pole and a stern lecture about pitch angles. You circle the cabin, carving a shallow trench as you go, because drifts love a door the way a cat loves a warm chair. The trench gives your walls a little breathing room, keeps the white tide from pushing against your logs like a slow, friendly siege engine. You picture the house as a ship in a snow sea, the trench its waterline. It's an indulgent metaphor, but it makes you take one more lap, scraping a bit farther, listening for the roof's answer. When the reply drops an octave from groan to sigh, you nod to no one in particular. The dog wags once, which is all the applause you get tonight. A quirky tidbit surfaces while you work. One of those things you read in a neighbour's margin or heard at a summer fair when your hands weren't frozen. Some households cut snow knives from green wood, wide paddles that slid under crust and peeled sheets off like bread from a pan. Others strung tarred rope along the ridge so a tug from the ground would unzip a load. Historians still argue how common those hacks were outside towns. The surviving tools are hard to date and ingenuity doesn't keep minutes. You consider a rope glance at your ridge and file the idea under projects for not tonight. Back inside the room greets you with that happy, heavy smell of damp wool warming and steam turning to comfort. Your cheeks prick as feeling returns. Your mittens hiss faintly over the hearth as snow steams away. You listen. The roof speaks less urgently now, a domestic grumble instead of a threat. Still you're not done. Weight loves corners. You fetch the shorter pole and prod the low places from the inside, mindful of sparks and hot iron. A dust of old bark and snow sift through the chinks you swore you'd fixed. Winter is the best inspector you never hired. Scholars will ask whether these midnight scrapes were routine or reserved for the worst blows. The answer lies in verbs, trudged, scraped, propped, braced action words that show up in journals like drum beats. You prop a beam with the spare post you cut last fall, a belt and suspenders move that makes you feel like an engineer with a license from the school of holding things up. The post bites the floor, the beam accepts the help without commentary, and the cabin, which is mostly wood, and a little personality settles into a better humour. Wind changes keys. A lower note now, the bass register of weather. Hard flakes begin to tap the glass of your lantern like fingernails at a cafe window. You picture some mischievous chorus out there asking to be let in. We're closed, you tell the storm, and somebody under a quilt laughs the way people laugh at 2 a.m. Quietly, gratefully, not because it's the best joke, but because it's a bridge to easier thoughts. The dog noses the door. You check the latch at a second peg. You tack a quilt across the hinges, a trick you wish you'd learned sooner. The room's temperature rises a degree you can feel but not measure. Hands return to needles with the instinct of people who turn waiting into mending. One pair darns a heel, rhythmic small saving a sock that would rather retire. Another finger walks along a seam in a quilt and drops 3 invisible stitches that will matter in some future gust. You stir the embers and lay a thin split that will catch without tantrum. And because even danger wants company, the roof punctuates the scene with a deep whoomb, a drift sliding off the high side, thudding into your trench like a sack of flour landing on a table. Everyone jumps. Then everyone breathes the way you do when a cart rattles past and doesn't stop at your door. You add lightly, "That was the roof doing yoga. Downward snow dog." It's not your finest work, but it earns you the tiny chorus of relief you were fishing for. The debate in your head returns: leave the thin film for insulation, or go one more round with the pole. Folklore says a little snow seals leaks. Experience says your leaks care more about wind than poetry. You compromise, clear the windward side to the boards, leave a polite sugar dusting on the lee. The result looks like a child's drawing of a roof, half frosted, half sober. Function over symmetry, survival over pretty. You pour a mug of hot water and hold it like it's a rare animal. Steam climbs and curls toward the rafters, finds a cool knot, and turns itself to a single drop that falls with a sound too small for the storm to hear. In that whisper you hear the whole bargain of the frontier. You do a little, the weather does a lot, and somehow the math comes out not fair and yet enough. A final check around the room. The brace holds. The door quilt billows slightly and then settles like a sleeping chest. The lantern glass wears a soft halo of fog you wipe with your sleeve out of habit. The straw ticks murmur when people shift that faint, paper sand sound of winter beds. Out beyond the trees converse in the old slow grammar of weight and wind. Your house answers with grammar of its own oak post pine beam birch peg. You speak it now, not fluently, but well enough to know when a sentence is about to break. You bank the fire. Not too low embers must last. Not too high sparks must behave. The dog turns twice and chooses the warmer lips where your boot prints dried. You let your shoulders fall. A human can't outscrape a sky, only help a roof remember what it's built to do. You've done enough for this hour. And just as the room begins to exhale into that careful calm that follows effort, a knock soft testing arrives under the howl. Not a branch, not a slide, not the house, a hand, another. Then a voice shaped by scarf and cold. You awake. You are, and so is the storm, and so apparently are your neighbours, who have brought stories the kind traded for warmth when snow makes the roads into rumours. But one tale they carry across the drifts will make you sit up despite your tired bones. The knock comes again softer now, as though even the visitor respects the fragile balance of quilts, coals, and weary bodies inside. You unbar the door, easing it open against the push of snow, and 2 neighbours step in wrapped so thoroughly in scarves and wool you can hardly tell who's who. Their cheeks glow red from the cold, their boots crusted with ice. A gust follows them, carrying a pinch of snow that melts instantly on the warm plank floor. They stamp their feet, murmur greetings, and hold out their hands toward the hearth. Steam rises as frost turns to droplets, the room filling with that sharp, wet smell of thawing wool. Everyone shifts to make space. The children stir, half awake, blinking at the new arrivals, and the dog thumps his tail once before curling back into his nest. Neighbours arriving in storms wasn't unusual. In fact, it was expected. Settlers learned quickly that stories, laughter, and company were just as valuable as food. Historians note how often diaries mention evenings spent in shared cabins, sitting shoulder to shoulder while snow rattled the shutters. Scholars still debate whether these visits were primarily about survival strategy or sheer human loneliness. Perhaps both. After all, survival without companionship is a pretty bleak equation. They bring stories as promised. One starts with the tale of a wagon buried in a drift so tall the family climbed out through the roof hatch. Another recounts the time smoke backed down a chimney, during a gale filling a cabin so thickly the family had to crawl outside and sit in the snow until it cleared. The listeners groan, laugh, and add their own tales in turn. The sensory anchors shift, the fiddle is fetched again, its notes scratchy but cheerful. The spoon clinks in the stew pot, stirring up one last ladle of thin broth for the guests. The neighbours' voices blend with the creak of rafters, weaving a strange harmony, wood and human storm and story. The cabin is alive in a new way, warm with sound, if not abundance. One of the guests shares something different, an old superstition. He says the bells you've been hearing at night are a sign of shifting weather, or perhaps wandering spirits that keep watch over travellers lost in the snow. The room falls quiet. Scholars would scoff, of course. Historians argue that these tales were coping devices, little myths spun to give storms a face, a voice, a reason. But in the hush of a long winter night, it's hard not to wonder. The dog lifts his head at the mention of Belle's ears, twitching eyes bright. You glance toward the window where frost feathers the panes into delicate patterns. The storm mutters beyond, not so fierce now, but steady, constant. And you feel it, that odd tingle at the edge of thought. Maybe the bells were more than wind after all. You shake off the notion with a soft laugh. If the bells want in, they'll have to knock like everyone else. The room exhales as chuckles ripple, the tension eased. But you tuck the story away in the back of your mind, another fragment of frontier folklore to keep you company. Because tomorrow, when the guests leave and the silence returns, you'll be back to the endless rhythm of repairs. And one chore particularly waits for you with bark sap and sticky fingers, mending the cracks with sheets of birch. But patching walls in a storm has its own peculiar hazards. Morning light seeps through cracks you swore you patched last week, sketching pale lines across the floor. You sigh, run your hand along the wall and feel it, the draft sneaky and insistent, pressing in like an uninvited guest. No matter how much mud you stuffed into those gaps, the storm has a way of prying loose your work. So today it's back to patching, but with a different material, birch bark. You step outside, boots crunching in the shallow trench you dug around the cabin, and head toward the line of trees. Birch stands out in this winter forest. Its white bark gleams against snow, peeling in curls that look like old paper, inviting you to peel it further. You tug gently, the bark crackling as it comes away papery sheets that bend but don't break. In your mittened hand, the bark feels smooth, almost waxy, and carries a faint woody scent a little sweeter than pine. Frontier families prized birch bark for repairs. It was light, flexible, and most importantly water-resistant. Peel enough sheets and you could line cracks, shingle temporary roofs, even wrap food or tinder. Historians point out that settlers borrowed this practice directly from indigenous peoples who used birch for everything from canoes to baskets. Scholars still debate how widely bark patching spread, since it left little trace for archaeology. Bark decomposes too quickly. But diaries frequently mention the sticky, sappy mess of trying to nail or wedge bark into drafty gaps. You haul an armful back to the cabin, fingers sticky with resin. The smell clings to you, sharp and earthy like sap warmed by the sun. Inside, you wedge a sheet into a stubborn seam. The bark bends, presses tight, and muffles the draft. For once, the wall doesn't argue. The sensory anchors stack up, the soft tear of bark as you trim it, the tacky pull of sap on your gloves, the low groan of timbers as the cabin shifts under snow. Even the sound of the wind changes, muffled now, as though the house has put on an extra coat. Of course not every patch is neat. Some bark curls popping out of place. You slap it back, wedge a peg, and mutter something sarcastic about frontier interior design. One neighbour laughs, saying at least the walls now have a fashionable pattern. Another jokes you'll start charging admission for your bark-papered parlour. You shake your head amused, but secretly pleased laughter makes patching less tedious. Quirky tidbit birch bark sometimes doubled as makeshift paper. Families scribbled shopping lists, recipes, even notes to neighbours on its pale surface. There are accounts of children practicing letters on bark scraps, the ink bleeding oddly into the waxy grain. Some historians insist settlers treasured every scrap of imported paper too much to waste, so bark became the everyday medium. Others argue it was rare and mostly anecdotal. Still, the image is irresistible. A cabin wall patched with bark, one sheet carrying a faint note like "Don't forget beans at the trading post." The fire pops as you press another patch into place. Warmth settles more evenly now, the draughts quieter, the shadows less restless. You step back, wipe sticky hands on your trousers and nod. It's not elegant, but then again, nothing on the frontier is. Survival rarely looks pretty, it just has to hold. And yet as the house steadies, you feel another tension creep in. The silence, the stillness. The days of repetition, wood bark, mud stew quilts pile up just as surely as the drifts outside. People call it cabin fever today. Back then it was simply life gnawing at the edges of patience. Because soon the walls won't be your only problem. It'll be your own restless mind, counting knots in wood and finding faces in the shadows. And that challenge in its quiet strangeness might be the hardest winter trial of all. The storm loosens its grip, but another weather moves in, quiet, heavy, strangely internal. You wake to a cabin that has nothing urgent to say. No pounding on the roof, no dramatic leaks, no neighbour at the door with a fiddle or a crisis. Just a stillness so complete you can hear the last curl of smoke make up its mind about which way to drift, and that somehow is harder. You sit up quilt slumping off your shoulders and stare at the wall. There a knot the size of a thumbnail looks like an eye you know too well. Next to it a thin resin trail hardened into the suggestion of a smile or a crack, or a map of a river that never existed. You count the knots 1, 2, 3, then start over because you can't remember whether that cluster shaped like a sleeping dog was 21 or 22. Counting isn't the point. The point is the rhythm. Numbers are a handrail you grip so you don't tumble into the long blank stairwell of winter hours. Historians like to write cabin fever with a knowing little smile as if it were quaint. The term itself shows up late in printed sources tangled with sea law and prison slang, but the feeling saturates earlier diaries. We grew short with each other. Little talk. The children fret. Scholars still argue whether the frontier invented a condition, or just amplified one with weather and walls. Some claim the remedy was obvious work. Others point to pages where work was done to a polish, and restlessness still roamed the room like a draught no quilt could catch. The debate leaves a gap where your day will live, so you build yourself a routine that pretends to be variety. You sweep even though the floor was swept. You stir the fire even though the embers behaved. You rearrange the pegs by the door so mittens hang left and hats hang right, then switch them back because it felt wrong, and you accuse yourself lightly of a mitten tyranny. A joke bubbles up management has decided to restructure the coat department. No one laughs loudly, but the corners of mouths move progress. Sensory anchors swap places with your restlessness. The ordinary becomes percussion tap of spoon on bowl tick, of cooling iron soft hiss when a new log admits the flame. Even silence develops textures. You can hear the room without hearing it. The cloth of the door quilt breathing against the latch, the wool's slow exhale when someone shifts the dog's paws, making dry paper sounds against straw as he dreams his private chases. If the earlier nights were scored in bells and wind, this day is scored in threads and small breaths. You reach for anything that turns time from a wall into a hallway. Stories help. You braid one slowly like rope, begin with a path through a stand of birch in summer, add a berry bush, a creek with water so cold it tennis elbows your teeth. Let the children interrupt with impossible additions, and then a bear, the polite kind, offers us tea. Yes, you say solemnly from a porcelain set he inherited. Gentle laughter as soft as the scrape of the ladle against the stew pot knocks loose a little stiffness from shoulders. You try games. Jacob's ladder from string. Cat's cradle fingers fumbling inside stiff mittens, the dog quite put out that no actual cat appears. Button whirligig on a loop of thread, the disc humming when you pull a tiny winter turbine that invents a breeze and a sound all at once. Quirky tidbit time, some families kept quiet toys expressly for the long months. Bone dice carved with flowers, carved puzzles, wooden cup and ball. One diary insists these toys saved sanity. Another scolds that fiddling breeds idleness. Historians still debate whether play was dignified survival or shameful dawdling. Your verdict is practical. If a spinning button keeps voices from fraying, let it sing. Reading helps too, though your library is threadbare. The Almanac, a borrowed sermon pamphlet, a few pages torn from a magazine used first for patterns and second for paragraphs. You read aloud anyway, savouring the roundness of words in a square room. Sentences feel like windows that don't let in cold. A neighbour dozes with a smile and you take that as a critic's favourable review. You even write a line or two yourself, notes on how the snow along the trench looks like a low white wall, on how the smoke climbed obediently today, on how the porridge tasted less sullen if you stirred counterclockwise and called it turning the tide. Will any of it matter in spring? Probably not. But ink is a way to say you were here, and you watched carefully. You cook unnecessarily careful lunches, thin soup poured slowly as if ceremony adds calories. You slice bread evenly, which feels like control, straight cuts in a season that runs ragged. The smell of onions, a luxury if you have them, lifts the room by a half-inch. You declare today we dine continental, and someone asks what continent. The quiet one, you say, and bowls clink in tidy applause. By afternoon a particular itch sets in. It is not hunger, not cold, not sleepiness. It is the need to open something door window the future. You crack the latch a fraction, and let in a sip of air. Your face shrinks from it, your lungs reach for it. The cold carries a sound water somewhere, not much, just a single tap, then a pause, then another tick. Tick. You follow it to the eaves and find a slender icicle, with a bright drop swelling at its tip, refusing to fall, refusing not to. You watch and wait, and finally it lets go. That small decision feels like news. Scholars argue whether these tiny thaws in midwinter marked real shifts, or were merely the weather's small cruelties promises made with fingers crossed. Diaries disagree delightfully. Hope a drop today countered by a deceitful sun the length of a match. You choose the hopeful entry because choosing is the only vote the season allows you. You put a pan under the drip not because you need the water, but because catching it turns the sound into a task. Now the tick means something. Now time is measured in spoonfuls. Cabin fever nips at relationships, so you rehearse grace. You answer a sharp word with a soft one. You let a complaint pass you by like a gust at the door. You assign a very serious job to small hands counting the woodpile and reporting inventory status with great ceremony. They return with solemn numbers, then extra numbers. Half logs count as 2 apparently. You don't correct the math. You praise the work. Gentle humour is insulation too. If someone says the stew is thin, you say yes, but it travels fast and watch a smile take the sting away. A bit of lore arrives in afternoon conversation and hang a bright scrap by the window to fool the light into lingering. A ribbon, a gingham square, a blue thread looped on a peg, anything to make your eye remember colour. Quirky perhaps, but you try it. The scrap glows uncertainly in the grey, and for a moment the room seems to recall meadows dyed cloth on a line, blueberries staining thumbs. Historians scoff at sentiment, then secretly collect these fragments as eagerly as you hang them. Scholars debate whether such little gestures mattered. You don't debate. You sit and look at your square of summer and feel your breath even out. The day stretches thin and translucent toward evening. You mend a sleeve with tiny fussy stitches, then admire the repair out loud as if you'd tamed a wild beast. You wipe the lantern glass so it won't bloom a halo of soot when lit. You fold the door quilt back and forth to shake out the tired shape, then hang it again. Domestic choreography dance slowly. Outside, the ice drop keeps voting for spring in patient intervals. For a moment you hear heaven help you a phantom jingle. Memory not metal, you decide, and let it pass. The house stays quiet. The dog snorts and resettles the rafters, answer the cold with a language that's mostly vowels and patience. You pour a thimble of molasses in the evening porridge, a celebration so small it wouldn't merit ink if you were stingy with pages. You're not stingy. You note it in the margin anyway, sweeten the night. When the lantern finally takes its place, light fills corners that had been thinking dark thoughts. Faces thaw, spines lengthen. You tell one last silly tale, the respectable bear with the porcelain tea set returns for a cameo, and the room rewards you with a soft chorus of mms and an honest giggle. The dog's tail thumps approval. You bow, which is to say you pick up the ladle and pretend it's a hat. If anyone ever accuses you of theatrics, you will plead winter and be acquitted. Bed comes as a concession. Not a victory, but concessions can be kind. You crawl under quilts still faintly perfumed with yesterday's steam and today's onions and laugh once at the very frontier of fancy. We are a soup with blankets. Someone tells you to hush. You do. The room's music returns to its smallest instrument's timber thread breath. Before sleep, you let yourself think one daring thought. What if tomorrow the sun has a little edge to it? Not warmth exactly, just the idea of warmth. What if the icicle learns a new tempo? What if the trench's wall slumps an honest inch? And what if a bird you don't ask for a song just feathers writes a brief note across the sky? You smile with your eyes closed because none of that is guaranteed and none of it is forbidden. The house exhales, you follow. The last sound you count is water finding its own way, one drop after another like a clock that has remembered its job. And when morning comes, if the light happens to glitter where it used to glare, you'll be there to notice. Because sometimes spring doesn't arrive with trumpets, it begins with a single patient drip and a bell made of ice. The next morning drags itself into being not with light, but with a dim metallic haze that looks more like the absence of night than the presence of day. You rise anyway, shoulders stiff, and reach for boots still damp around the edges. The house feels quieter than usual, too quiet, as though everyone has slipped into their own thoughts and forgotten to bring their voices with them. Cabin fever isn't loud, it's whispery, restless, like an itch you can't find on your back. You stand at the hearth, poke the embers, and tell yourself there are chores. There are always chores. But the broom seems to have swept itself already. The firewood pile is stacked in fussy perfection, and the patched bark walls stare back at you like they're daring you to invent another excuse to touch them. You sigh, then smirk. Well, the broom union might strike if I overwork it. The neighbour across the quilts huffs a laugh, grateful for any sound that isn't silence. Cabin fever shows up differently for everyone. Some pace wearing paths in straw mats and floorboards. Some go inward, answering questions with one-word grunts. Children often swing between bursts of manic play and long sulks curling like tired cats in corners. Diaries record all of it. John grows testy, Mary won't rise, the children quarrel. Scholars still debate whether the boredom itself was the illness, or if it was simply malnutrition and sleep deprivation masquerading as irritability. Archaeological evidence, nothing but uneven wear marks in floorboards, whispers its own version. Someone walked and walked and walked waiting for Thor. You lean against the doorframe and listen to the sensory anchors of monotony. The rafters tick like tired clocks. The quilts sigh as someone turns over. A kettle hisses just shy of a boil, then settles. The dog snores, then lets out a soft whine, chasing something in his sleep. These sounds don't change. They repeat, stacking one atop another until they blur into a kind of music so dull it threatens to lull you into nothingness. You fight back with rituals. Today you count nails hammered into the beams. 23 in this wall, 37 in the next. Tomorrow maybe you'll count knots again. You organise spoons, then reorganise them by size, then by which ones feel heavier in the hand. You test yourself, how long can I hold my breath while walking to the far corner? 40 steps, 1 inhale, 1 exhale. You mark the number on a scrap of birch bark and call it science. Quirky tidbit, some families kept tally sticks during long winters, not just for accounts or debts, but for keeping track of days that blurred together. 1 notch for each sunrise, another for each visitor, sometimes a carved mark for an argument or a laugh. Historians puzzle over these sticks when they survive. Were they calendars or journals or simply doodles of restless hands? Scholars still argue. But in truth it doesn't matter. A notch is just a way to say this day happened so the days don't swallow you whole. By afternoon the mood in the cabin sags. Quilts feel heavier, voices grow thinner. Someone suggests a story but no one starts. So you do it leaning into the lull. You describe the blizzard as though it were a rude neighbour knocking too often, then invent a courtroom drama where the blizzard is on trial for disturbing the peace. A child giggles, adding that the snow should be sentenced to shovelling itself. The laughter breaks the silence, fragile but real, and for a while everyone breathes easier. Scholars note how humour stitched into diaries, little jokes about cows falling asleep standing up, or husbands who lost their socks by the fire acted like release valves. Cabin fever wasn't banished, but it could be distracted. Even now you feel it, the tension easing in the corners of the room, the storm outside sounding less like a prison, and more like background noise. And yet when the lantern dims and the chatter dies, the silence creeps back. You lie on the straw-tick quilts, heavy on your chest, staring at the beam above your head. The knot that looked like an eye yesterday now looks like a mouth open wide. You blink, shift, laugh at yourself. Imagination is just another squatter in the cabin. Still, you know this much: winter isn't won in grand gestures. It's endured in small defences, jokes, notches, the steady clink of a spoon against a bowl. And tomorrow you'll find a new defence in movement. Because when the walls begin to press too close, the only cure is to strap on snowshoes and carve a path through the endless white. By dawn, the cabin feels smaller than ever. The quilts hang heavier. The air inside is stale with smoke and damp wool, and even the dog has taken to sighing loudly as if filing complaints with management. You know the cure isn't another story, another sweep of the broom, or even one more careful notch on a stick. No, the only answer is outside. You strap on snowshoes, tugging the stiff leather until it creaks, and step into the drifted world. The snow greets you with its usual trick, bottomless if you trust it, firm if you don't. With the wide frames underfoot, you skim the surface, each step a muted shh across a field of white. Your breath plumes upward sharp and quick, and the air is so clean it burns on the way in. After days inside, it feels like drinking glass. The trees stand tall, their branches bent low under the weight of storms. Each movement sends powder cascading down in slow curtains. Somewhere distant, a woodpecker taps its rhythm, echoing like a hammer in an empty church. The forest is hushed, but not silent. Every sound is magnified. The squeak of leather straps the creak of your coat, the steady pulse of your boots pressing snow. These are the sensory anchors of freedom, as humble as they are. Historians remind us that snowshoe treks weren't leisure. They were necessity, hauling wood, checking traplines, seeking neighbours. Scholars still debate whether families considered these trips punishment or relief. Some diaries read like complaints, endless trudging through cold. Others sparkle with gratitude, describing the forest as escape from the cabin's press of walls. Perhaps it was both arduous work that nevertheless gave you back your sky. You pause at the edge of a frozen creek. The ice groans under snow's weight, low and resonant like a drum played too slowly. You lean on your pole, studying the line of trees beyond. There a deer moves, delicate, hesitant, its breath steaming in the air. It stares at you, ears flicking, then bounds away, snow spraying behind it like thrown flour. For a moment you feel part of something larger, less trapped, less human. You laugh softly, shaking your head. And here I thought I was escaping cabin fever. Turns out I've just joined the local wildlife club. The joke goes unheard, but it keeps you company as you push forward. Quirky tidbits, some settlers described snowshoe treks as meditative, claiming they could measure distance not in miles, but in the rhythm of steps. Others joked about snowshoe etiquette: never step into someone else's trail, unless invited, lest you undo their hard-earned path. Historians still argue if this was genuine or just a frontier in joke. Either way, the etiquette lives on in your mind as you cut your own trail proud in the pointless dignity of fresh prints. The cabin waits when you return, a squat shadow against the endless white. Inside, quilts will still hang heavy, the porridge will still be bland, the rafters will still creak. But your lungs feel bigger, your step lighter. For a while you've reminded yourself that the world isn't just four walls and a smoky roof. It's snow, sky, trees, and the endless patience of walking. You knock the snow from your shoes at the door, step back inside, and let the warmth wrap you again. Cabin fever will return, of course it will. But so will the trails, the trees, the deer, and the quiet promise of fresh air. And with that, the season circles again, walls patched, fire-tended stories, told neighbours, welcomed blizzards fought, and steps pressed into the snow. Until the thaw comes and the world remakes itself in green. The storm has passed, the fire has dwindled to soft embers, and the cabin rests in a hush that feels almost weightless. You ease back, close your eyes, and let the rhythm of the long season settle into something slower, quieter, like a river slipping into still water. The quilts are heavy on your chest, but no longer a burden, more like a steady hand pressed gently across your shoulder. The sounds that once seemed sharp are softened now. The rafters creak, but it's the kind of creak that belongs to an old friend stretching after a long nap. The faint sigh of wind through the chinks is no longer a threat, just background music, a flute played far away. Even the dog's soft snore becomes a kind of lullaby, steady and certain proof that survival for tonight requires no more effort. You picture the cabin from outside, tucked beneath its cap of snow smoke curling upward in a thin silvery line. Around it the world is white and endless, but inside is warmth, and inside is rest. It is small, yes, but it is steady. It has carried you through noise, through hunger, through creaking roofs and restless nights, and now it carries you into quiet. Your breath slows. Each inhale tastes faintly of wood smoke and wool. Each exhale dissolves into the room as though joining the fabric of its calm. The walls no longer press in, they cradle. The roof no longer groans, it hums. Time itself loosens, stretches out like quilts smoothed over a bed. And if your thoughts wander, let them wander gently. Drift across the white fields, follow the deer into the woods. Let your snowshoe trail vanish behind you. Imagine the thaw waiting at the edge of the horizon, not rushing toward you, but patient, kind, inevitable. The blizzards are not forever, and neither is the long night. For now you are safe, for now you are warm, and for now you can rest.